Good morning. I'm Leila Abed, Director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of our policy recommendations on farm labor across North America. The U.S. and Mexican food systems are deeply intertwined and interdependent. Mexico supplies roughly half of America's fresh fruit and vegetables, with an import increase in winter months. Similarly, in Mexico, roughly 74% of agricultural imports come from the United States. Last year, Mexico emerged as the top U.S. agricultural export market with $30 billion in exports, displacing both China and Canada. The importance of agricultural trade between both countries is heightened by the labor force of farm workers that produce these goods and products. In the US, 80% of farm workers are Mexican born. Of these 2 million workers, an estimated 850,000 are undocumented, while 300,000 use the H-2A visa program, a temporary work visa specifically made for agricultural jobs. Given the significance of U.S.-Mexico trade, as well as the participation of Mexican labor in the American agricultural workforce, changes to trade, immigration, and temporary worker visa programs can have serious implications for the prosperity of American farms, farmers, and food security across North America. To address shared challenges pertaining to the agricultural sector on both sides of the border, the Mexico Institute has engaged in a multi-year research project in partnership with CSS in Guadalajara and the Migration Dialogue at UC Davis, assessing Mexico's export produce industry and strengthening protections for migrant workers in North American agriculture. During today's event, the leaders of these two outstanding teams, Dr. Philip Martin and Dr. Agustin Latapi, will present evidence-based policy recommendations for the U.S. and Mexican governments and the private sector, which are all grounded in years of research and ongoing interactions with relevant stakeholders. After their presentations, we will take a brief 10-minute break and reconvene for a panel with Phil and Agustin, who will be joined by Darcy Vetter, former Chief Agricultural Negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and Dr. Laura Ann Minkoff-Cern, Associate Professor of Food Studies, Geography, and the Environment at Syracuse University. This panel will explore the geopolitical context of policy recommendations with a specific focus on migration dynamics and trade. So without further ado, I turn it over to Virginia Bullington, the Mexico Institute's program coordinator, to go over a few housekeeping notes and logistics before we begin. I want to thank, again, everybody on this call, especially to Dr. Phil Martin and Dr. Agustin Latapi for being here. And I'm hoping for a very insightful, timely, and relevant discussion. Virginia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Leila. And I just want to thank everyone as well for being here in the audience, and to Phil, Augustine, Laura Ann, and Darcy. I'm honored to be a part of this project. I've been working on it for about a year. And we talk a lot about the US-Mexico trade relationship. Specifically, I think we focus on manufacturing, supply chains, but a big part of that, as Leila laid out, is agriculture and the food that we eat. Food is primary, and we all consume it every day. And it's been a privilege to work with and promote the scholarship of these two research teams working to improve the lives of the individuals that harvest this food for us, and improve working conditions for this essential work. So we will have opportunities for you, audience members, to send input, questions, comments throughout both the presentations and the panel. And those can be sent to my email address at virginia.bullington@wilsoncenter.org. That email address is in the description on the event webpage. You can also tweet to our X account at Mexico Institute. And so, yes, you can look for those handles and that email address in the description. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Phil Martin, who will start us off with the policy recommendations and research from the US perspective.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much. I'm Phil Martin. I'm a professor of agricultural and resource economics at the University of California at Davis. And with the support of the Walmart Foundation, we have been looking at the conditions of farm workers in export agriculture in Mexico, as well as in labor-intensive agriculture in the United States for the past 5 or 6 years. And what we're doing today is beginning with recommendations for policy reform in the United States, and then Augustine will follow up with recommendations for improving conditions for workers employed on export farms in Mexico. So the two recommendations in the two major recommendations for the U.S. Center on the H-2A program that Virginia mentioned, the H-2A program is a non-immigrant or temporary worker program that was created in 1952 and was relatively small until about after the recovery from the 2008-2009 recession. So you can see on the chart that until really 2013, 2014, we never certified more than 100,000 jobs in the United States to be filled by H-2A workers. Since then, we've almost quadrupled to 400,000 jobs certified. So to put that in context, there's an average of about 1.5 million jobs in US agriculture. The average H-2A workers in the US about 6 months. So roughly 1/6 of average employment in US crop agriculture is filled by these H-2A workers. So we know the program is growing. 92% of the workers are Mexicans, and the program is concentrated in 5 states. So H-2A workers are concentrated in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, California, and Washington. What's behind all of this, and what's the response of agriculture, and what can we do to make things better? Well, the starting point is that farm labor costs are going up. They're going up faster than non-farm labor costs. That is leading to mechanization, more migrant H-2A workers, and more imports. So the first question is, of course, why are farm labor costs going up so much? And the simple answer is the demand for hand workers in agriculture has been relatively stable, and the supply of US workers, including unauthorized workers who settled in the US, is shrinking. I've already mentioned we have about 1.5 million average jobs in US agriculture. You think of that as one person working 6 months, another person working 6 months, and that makes for one year-round job. But remember, that's 2 workers. And when we look across agriculture, we see it's about 2.5 million unique individuals to fill those 1.5 million jobs. Obviously, there are more unique workers when the task is very seasonal, like harvesting apples for 2 or 3 months, but there's less workers involved when it's in dairies where the job lasts year round. There are several ways in which we get workers on farms. The most important across the United States is the farmer hires a worker. That's or what we call a direct hire worker. But you can also have workers brought to farms by crop support services. So 40% of all workers across the US on crop farms are brought there by non-farm employers. That's usually labor contractors. In California, it's 60%. And in the H-2A program, it's 50%. So we're making recommendations on H-2A. We're also making recommendations on these crop support services, think labor contractors, who bring workers to farms. As both Leila and Virginia said, 2.5 million unique farm workers, 2 million were born in Mexico, that's 80%. 1.7 million of those Mexican-born workers are settled in the US. They're about half unauthorized, and they're older. They're in their 40s. The 300,000 Mexican H-2As are younger. They're an average of a decade younger, and they're both younger and better educated, and they're higher productivity. They pick strawberries, apples, and everything else much faster. So with those labor costs going up, with fewer settled US workers, we're getting a lot of mechanization. It's not just harvesting machines, it's also pruning machines, weeding machines. They're mechanical aids to let workers work faster. There's the movement of farm production indoors into greenhouses, shade structures, other things. We're also having more H-2A workers, and we're also importing more fruits and vegetables. So all three are happening simultaneously, and we have to almost look commodity by commodity to see what will happen. There's 2 more of these, and then we'll go into the pictures that show the farm labor. So you have to think of a farm labor system maybe in some ways as a super tanker in the middle of the ocean. It's really difficult to turn around, but in a lifetime, you might be able to move it 1 degree closer to the true north position. The big three trends that are backgrounds for the farm labor system of the 2020s are that exceptions in labor law for US agriculture have gone down. And I think Augustine will tell us that the same thing is true in Mexico. So the farm labor market is increasingly regulated like the non-farm labor market. Minimum wages apply in agriculture. There's overtime pay required for farm workers in many states. There is the requirement to have workers' compensation insurance in case of injury. There are paid sick leave programs. So it's both a combination of federal and state laws have gotten rid of what used to be agricultural exceptionalism. The direct hire farm workers, those directly hired by the employer, by the farm where they work, those workers are working longer. They have one employer, and their US educated children don't look for the seasonal farm jobs of their parents. They climb the US job ladder. What are farmers doing in response? There's a lot more outsourcing. And the biggest entity that brings workers to farms are farm labor contractors. And it's important to emphasize that farm labor contractors normally have a bad reputation, but in practice, they are among the best and the worst farm employers. Many of them perhaps are the worst, but they're also, it's important to emphasize, are the best. Farm labor contractors can be win-win because after all, the labor contractor assembles crews of seasonal workers to bring onto a farm, perform a seasonal task, and move on. But they can also be risk absorbers for labor law violations. So if labor law violations in an industry are very common, like hiring unauthorized workers, then the risk of any kind of enforcement gets shoved from the farm to the labor contractors. And so the main challenge we've been dealing with is how do you really regulate these labor contractors whose importance is growing? How do you protect the H-2A workers who have contracts and who are vulnerable while they're employed in the United States? And the main recommendations of this project are really to let employers distinguish themselves, incentivize and reward the best employers and the reliable H-2A workers. Have something like a TSA pre-check system so that good employers and workers who are returning year after year, as many do, can get an expedited process to come in. Second is to think of H-2A reliable, experienced H-2A crews, something like the so-called FIFO crews, fly in, fly out crews that do mining and oil work in remote areas. So people don't live on the North Slope of Alaska. Workers fly in, they work long hours, the training occurs in Texas or Colorado or somewhere else, and then you have the minimum number of trained employees who are needed to get that work done. Can we do something like that with seasonal agriculture? We've got a lot of private certification programs. These are certification programs that develop protocols, and labor contractors or employers who satisfy the protocol get certified, and that becomes knowledge to buyers and other people. So you're trying to use market pressures to bring that super tanker closer to the heading of labor law compliance. And finally, with all of these things happening at once, how do you integrate trends toward mechanization, toward more H-2A workers, toward trade to make a system that works? It's important to probably step back and remember that during Mr. Trump's first presidency, there were really no big changes to the H-2A program. The H-2A program expanded, the House approved Farm Workforce Modernization Act, but there really weren't any big significant changes other than growth. Mr. Biden made a number of changes to the H-2A program, including moving from having one of these adverse effect wage rate, the special minimum wage that has to be paid to H-2A workers, to having many adverse effect wage rates in each state. In 2024, there were some worker protection regulations put in place. Many of those regulations issued by Mr. Biden have been blocked by the courts. And so the question is, will the Trump administration 2.0, will they abandon those, or will they try to roll them back or do something else? What farmers want is primarily three things. They want this adverse effect wage rate to be frozen or modified or perhaps eliminated. They want year-round jobs, like in dairies, to be opened for H-2A workers. And there's a lot of discussion of following other countries, including Australia and the United Kingdom, and charging seasonal farm workers for their housing. Perhaps not the total cost, but a partial cost. On the other hand, we know that Project 2025 said the goal of government policy should be to phase out the H-2A program and subsidize mechanization. So what's about the future? Well, if we want new workers coming into U.S. crop agriculture, they're probably going to come from outside the U.S. And at this point, they're probably going to come via the H-2A program. And what we're going to be competing with in many commodities is whether it's going to be machines to harvest those commodities, whether the production will move indoors, or whether the fruits and vegetables will come from other countries, typically lower wage countries. Just by way of background, remember that agriculture is divided into a whole lot of different sectors: hog farming, chicken farming, corn and wheat, but 5 of them are all that count when it comes to farm labor. And those big 5 are crop support. Remember, that's mostly labor contractors, greenhouse and nurseries, fruits and nuts, dairy farms, and vegetables. Those are the 5 sectors that pay over 2/3 of farm wages. We don't know where crop support workers, that's labor contractor workers, work, but we think most of them work in fruits and vegetables. Labor contractors should and could be win-win for farmers and for workers. So the labor contractor lines up a series of jobs for me, the seasonal worker, and the farmer turns to a labor contractor to get a crew of workers. Labor contractors historically emerged as the bilingual intermediaries between employers and workers who did not speak the same language. They didn't start with Mexicans. They started with Chinese workers in California in the 1880s. Then they went to Japanese and then Punjabi. So there's a whole history of waves of immigrants and the emergence of bilingual intermediaries between typically US-born white farmers and a minority immigrant workforce. Greenhouse and nurseries are a sector we don't think about as much, perhaps, but it's important to remember that there's a fairly significant amount of money paid to workers who were employed in nurseries and increasingly producing food undercover. What is typically occurring in Canada and Mexico is that some kind of structure protects growing plants that facilitates organic production. It also raises yields enormously. It turns farm work into something more like factory work, because there's controlled entry and exit, lots more electronics, lots more technology. The big 6 fruit crops that hire hand workers are those we mostly think about. It's apples, grapes, strawberries, then other berries like blueberries, raspberries, tree nuts, and then other non-citrus fruits, peaches, nectarines, things like that. In every case, each of these commodities hires an average of 20 to 30,000 workers, or in order to get the total workforce, remember, you have to double that. And then to that, add the workers brought by labor contractors. So it's not 20 or 30,000 unique workers. It can easily be 60 to 100,000 unique workers when we consider the fact that these jobs are seasonal. You need to string several of them together to get one year-round job, and there could be workers brought by labor contractors. So the main story is there was a huge influx of unauthorized Mexicans in the 1990s and early 2000s. Many went into agriculture. They filled seasonal jobs. They had US-born children. Those US-born children, by and large, are not going into farm work. And so that has pushed farmers to switch to the H-2A program. The H-2A program has this special adverse effect minimum wage, and it is higher than the federal or state minimum wage in every state. How much higher? In California, it's about 20% higher. In some of the southeastern states that still have a $7.25 federal minimum wage, the adverse effect wage rate is twice as high. And so we have these rising costs, shrinking settled U.S. workforce. The big three responses are mechanization, H-2As, and imports. And the question is, how does policy consider that? Well, remember that we have mechanized an awful lot of things in agriculture. A whole lot of commodities that we said could not be mechanized, in fact, are mechanized. A lot of the focus is on the harvest because it's the most time sensitive, often labor sensitive. But it's important to remember that a lot of pre-harvest things have been mechanized as well, removing weeds, getting rid of excess plants, pruning trees, etc. The big issue is that in many cases, mechanization requires a change in how the crop is grown and how it is harvested and handled. And there's been efforts there are prototype machines to harvest just about everything that's possibly grown, including mushrooms. But in many cases, or in most cases, those machines are not yet as efficient as hand pickers. So the apples are the largest single employer of U.S. farm workers, both H-2A and U.S. workers, because it's a big crop. It's spread over several important states, including Washington, Michigan, New York. And the robotic apple pickers produce exactly what a hand picker does. And sort of if you think of the challenge, a hand picker can pick one apple or strawberry roughly every 2 seconds. We don't know what the efficiency of hand pickers is. That is, there's 100 good apples on the tree. How many does the picker get? We think it's 95%. Now think what a machine has to do. It has to detect it. It has to position itself to pick it. It's got to pick it. And then it's got to convey it to a bin. And suppose it's 95% efficient at each of those tasks. Well, that means it's only 81% efficient overall. And that means a grower might lose 15 or 20% of the crop. And the question is, can growers afford to do that? So mechanization is there, it's coming. The question is, how fast will it come? In between, you can reduce lifting and carrying. And there's a lot of work being done here so that, remember, fruits and vegetables are typically 90% water. How do you reduce the time that a worker who has already picked those strawberries or apples has to spend up and down ladders or moving the harvested strawberries to a collection station? So lots of work on robotic carriers to reduce that lifting and carrying and allow workers to pick more faster. But we're really focused on the H-2A program. It's a growing program, but the growth has slowed in part because of the new regulations in the Biden administration that raise cost alongside the higher adverse effect wage rate. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that the Department of Labor handles applications from roughly 15,000 U.S. employers. So we have a little over 100,000 U.S. employers, farm employers, registered with unemployment insurance, and about 15,000, about 1 in 6, apply for H-2A jobs. But if you look carefully, you'll notice that almost 70% of the employers request fewer than 10 jobs. And collectively, it's fewer than 10% of all jobs. So most of the time, the government is dealing with employers who are getting certified for very few jobs. But there are 300 large employers that each get over 500 certifications, and they account for a third. We may not easily have a good certification program for all the small employers. That's where many of the abuses come. But we should be able to get some kind of a program for the bigger ones. And that's the problem. The H-2A program is really complex. Employers make over 20 attestations when they sign the form. Many employers never actually read, especially the smaller employers, don't actually read all of those things that they're promising to do in wages and housing and transportation and everything else. And so what happens is if H-2A is done right, the cost is quite a bit higher than hiring U.S. workers. And so the obvious question is, why would anybody hire H-2A workers and and have a cost of $30 an hour if in California you could hire US workers at $20 an hour? And the answers, of course, are that the H-2A workers are higher productivity. They are labor insurance because they have a contract. They can't go to work for somebody else. And there's no Social Security tax on H-2A wage. The US workers, of course, will change employers if they can get high earnings. And so what has been happening is that farm worker advocates and employers negotiated an agreement in the late 1990s, so over 20 years ago, originally called Ag Jobs. Now it's called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And the basic idea was Congress was going to fix everything. Well, that hasn't happened. So what could be done in between? Well, that's this idea of a TSA pre-check for the multi-year certification and a multi-year visa for A-rated employers and employees. The idea of when crews come in, they come with supervisors, drivers, and cooks. It's a big package. And we aim for fewer and larger recruiters. If I only need 5 H-2A workers, why have me go through the entire process? If there's some sort of an entity like a labor contract or an association that can have a private compliance system and achieve economies of scale in recruiting workers and making sure labor laws are enforced. So this idea of allow employers and workers to certify that they're good, give them an expedited procedure, and favor fewer and larger certified intermediaries. Of course, there's a third option, and that is imports. We import most of our fresh fruit and a growing share of the fresh vegetables that are consumed in the US, and Mexico is the most important source. The main reason for imports is climate. We don't produce bananas and other tropical fruits, but there are other reasons as well, including lower labor cost and the idea that in Mexico, Peru, and other places, many of the commodities are produced under some kind of controlled environment agriculture, some kind of structure that protects them. From Mexico, the big three fresh exports are tomatoes, avocados, and berries. The growth has been in berries. These are typically luxury items consumed by higher income Americans, and the share that is imported of things like red raspberries is going up enormously. So Mexico, as Augustine's going to tell us here in a minute, has farms that specialize in producing fruits and vegetables, not for Mexicans, but for Americans. They abide by US food safety standards, packaging standards, et cetera, so that when we look at what is grown in Mexico, over half of the cucumbers, asparagus, broccoli that's grown in Mexico is not consumed in Mexico. It's exported to the United States. And even though Mexico consumes lots of avocados and tomatoes and other things, a growing share of the Mexican production of those commodities is exported to the US. So let me just close by saying that the United States is not alone in looking for answers to how to improve seasonal worker programs for agriculture. Every country richer than its neighbor has a seasonal farm worker program, including Mexico, that has a program for Guatemalans in the southern part of the country, or Costa Rica, which has a program for Nicaraguans, or Argentina, which has a program for Bolivians. So around the world, Malaysia brings in Bangladeshis and Indonesians to work in its agriculture. And of course, the United Kingdom has programs, Australia and New Zealand have programs, Germany, every country has it. But the thing to keep in mind is that countries are grappling with what's the best way to provide the opportunities for lower wage workers to work, to fill jobs that would otherwise go unfilled, but to ensure labor compliance in a very complex system. I mean, I leave you with the last word that if you eat a fresh tomato today, whether that tomato was grown in Mexico or Canada or the United States, there is a very high probability that 99% probability that tomato was picked by a Mexican-born worker. So thank you very much. I will now escape and stop sharing, and we can move to Augustine.
Thank you, Phil. And I just want to make sure that there are not any clarifying questions from the audience. I haven't received anything. Or through the X account. Wonderful. So we'll have a little bit more time for questions after Augustine's presentation. So without further ado, Augustine, over to you.
Thank you very much. And here it is. Well, first of all, I want to thank the Wilson Center for actually letting us do this work for many years now. And it's been fascinating work, so thank you. And I want to thank the task force because they've been especially committed to actually developing the recommendations that I'll be talking about later. And of course, thanks to everyone who's attending the webinar. I also want to say that each recommendation that we have crafted is backed by a long technical document that I will not be talking about, but that is available to anyone who's interested in this webinar, that describes exactly which procedures you have to engage in order to actually implement the recommendation that we're talking about. And because Phil started with numbers, and my presentation doesn't really have the total of farm workers in Mexico, I want to let you know a little bit about that. According to the Mexican population census in 2020, we have 2.28 million waged farm workers in Mexico. The total farm workers is larger because there are many who don't earn wages, but the waged farm workers in 2020 were about 2.3 million. I estimate that to have grown to about 2.6, 2.7 million in 2025. Now, another survey which asks people what kind of work they have done for the past 3 months finds that about 3.7 million Mexicans have engaged in some kind, at least one day, of farm work for the past 3 months. And as you can see, that's a larger population group, just as in the States, the total number of people who have done some agricultural work is larger than the total number of jobs. And finally, in the agricultural census of 2022, employers reported a total of 15.9 million contracts for 1 year. And that may mean contracts that last a day or a week, or that may mean a year-long contract. But as you can see, there's a large difference between the number of people who say that they earn their living this way and the total number of contracts that we are dealing with. Also, in export agriculture, we don't have these numbers. It's much smaller. It's about 1/4 of the total. I estimate export agricultural employment to total between 650,000 to 750,000 workers. 85% of those are actually with Social Security. So most of Mexico's farm workers with Social Security actually work in the export sector. And one final thing about H2A is that, sorry, am I sharing my screen or not?
Yes.
Okay, great. One final thing is that all H2A workers who go to the States have been trained in Mexico. And the productivity threshold demanded by US employers of these workers has been going up. So when I say trained in Mexico, it really means teaching workers and workers learning to actually be very productive before they go to the States. We have been doing this kind of work for a long time, and specifically this one on farm workers since 2017. We have provided the most rigorous evidence on Mexican farm employment, and these issues have become more and more crucial today for Mexico-US relationships and for USMCA. For this project specifically, the Wilson Center, CIESAS, and UC Davis invited a group of top stakeholders in Mexican and US agriculture to study what has been achieved in agriculture, what challenges remain, and to agree on recommendations that improve recruitment and working conditions for Mexican farm workers. Very recently, since about 3 months ago, the newly elected Mexican government also announced its own plans for farm workers. So this is how Mexican agriculture and Mexican farm employment has evolved. The number one fact is Mexico's agriculture has been very successful, and specifically Mexican export agriculture has been extremely successful. At the same time, decent jobs in export agriculture have increased quite importantly, although not to 100% of the jobs in agriculture, only to about one-fourth of all those jobs in agriculture, which are fairly equivalent to export jobs. Extreme poverty in export areas has fallen very significantly. But starting in 2020, job formality growth stumbles, and in 2023 and 24, it clearly falls. So there is a challenge, and we want to see how we can improve matters. This is Mexican exports to the US for the past 25 years. And as you can see, the pace of Mexican exports to the US, agricultural exports, actually accelerates after 2008. So there is a quite fast growth of Mexican exports, a much slower growth of US to Mexico exports. And so there is a growing trade surplus in Mexico and in agricultural terms. But are there benefits to this? I think there are. So growing trade and growing integration have, number one, brought stability to food markets. And we must remember that climate change is making stability sometimes an unattainable goal. So this is important. Facilitated near and friend shoring. And this means that Mexican produce in US shelves actually has a very long shelf life, unlike what you can import from other places. Mexican agriculture has yielded very substantial profits to investors from the US, from Mexico, and from many other countries that are investing in Mexico. It has improved North America's food security, and this is important. So the supply has been there for Americans and for North Americans in general. And finally, it has achieved substantial gains for the workers. Agriculture, it must be clearly said, has been the worst sector to work in Mexico for Mexican workers. In 2010, only 8% of agricultural workers had Social Security, so there were very few decent jobs in agriculture. That grew to about 26% of the total in 2023. And so formal jobs were growing quite quickly in Mexican agriculture. This is a graph showing the recent performance of Social Security jobs, which I say are decent jobs, in Mexico's primary sector. This means agriculture, forestry, and cattle ranching. And as you can see, there's growth until about 2020, 2021. But in 22 and 23, the total decent jobs in Mexico's primary sector actually falls. So they have stagnated, and that is the major challenge right now. Why have they stagnated? Number one, the sheer cost. 32.8% is when you employ a worker formally, 32.8% of gross pay goes to IMSS and Infonavit, the Social Security, and to the Housing Institute. And employers estimate that there's another 30% in other costs. There are very few incentives for workers to join jobs with Social Security. The clinics are overcrowded, especially in rural areas. There is no child care, especially not in rural areas. And there are long and complex procedures to access, for example, maternity leave. Also, there has been no access to housing savings for a long time. Most farm labor contractors in Mexico employ workers informally, and in 23-24, the dollar fell relative to the peso, which means that exports became cheaper and therefore profit margins were squeezed. Interest rates were multiplied by 3, and water became more scarce. The final factor is that the minimum wage was growing extremely quickly, about 20% per year from 2019 to 2024. Now it has slowed down a little bit. And this means that right now, in 27 Mexican states, farm workers earn below the farm worker minimum wage. And this is really a serious situation. Wages, in spite of this fact, have kept rising. So nominal minimum wages in Mexico have risen 181% in 6 years. Actual wages are rising fastest in agriculture than in any other sector. And in export states, real wages rise faster, whether it's formal employment in these states or informal, but they are rising faster there. In 2023, real agricultural wages also kept rising in spite of the fact that, as I described, there was very little growth in decent jobs. What has been also accomplished in the long term is that in export municipalities, extreme poverty, and this is the red bars going down here, has fallen much more rapidly than in Mexico in general. There are a few exceptions, those on the right of the graph, but in most of these municipalities, poverty falls very, very quickly. And that is something that export agriculture has done for Mexico. But there are drawbacks. For example, Mexico forbade the employment of underage workers in agriculture. And as you can see, from 2015 to 2023, the number of underage workers in Mexico is increasing. Now, it's not increasing in export states, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A. Now, soon we will be facing, and we don't know if it's next year or this year, soon we will be facing a renegotiation of USMCA. And to fare well in those negotiations, Mexican exporters must show that they're ethical employers and that they help lower immigration. This is not just something that is good for exporters, it's something that is mandated in USMCA law or in USMCA agreements. And also, Mexico must show progress in eradicating child labor, forced labor, and informal labor in agriculture. We have 3 sets of recommendations. The first one has to do with improving recruitment in Mexico and providing continuous employment. We recommend that the government strengthen ethical recruitment protocols and safety for workers during transit from their hometowns to export regions. And there's many actors that can collaborate here, including a number of the organizations in our task force. 2, educating workers concerning the rights and providing 800 numbers to them so that they can report any anomalies. 3, recommend that Mexico's National Migration Institute improve their protocols relating to how they detain and inspect buses moving from Mexico South to Mexico's export regions. They do stop them, and often they get Mexican workers off the bus because they can't provide the right papers. So that means that workers must be provided with the right Mexican papers to make sure that they have a safe trip and they can get a formal job. We also recommend that the National Employment System or employer groups coordinate employment at workers' destinations, providing job continuity, so that this problem with having a job for 1 week and then being unemployed is not the norm for workers who travel. And finally, improve the information available to Mexican workers concerning legitimate recruitment channels for H-2A and the 800 numbers for potential complaints. We find that there is a lot of fraud, and many Mexican workers pay $800 or similar amounts to people who promise you H-2A jobs but never deliver them. Our second set has to do with services and benefits that make formality attractive for the workers. Number one is municipal governments receive federal funds for social infrastructure, and this is something that is happening all of the time. We intend to work with them to direct funds to childcare centers and to urban social infrastructure in the places where the farm workers live. This is not for new developments for the middle class, but targeting the poor areas of the municipalities very carefully. Also, Mexico's Family Development Institute is developing a large number of childcare centers. We have worked with them, but we intend to keep working with them to focus development in immigration areas and especially in farm worker immigration areas. Next, services that workers and employers pay for through the Social Security Institute must actually be effectively delivered to the workers. Next is that workers save through the Housing Institute, and this is a very large amount that they pay to the Housing Institute. So access to their savings should be improved. And this is something that the government has just promised. So we want to keep monitoring that progress. And finally, we discovered that access by indigenous farmers, people who own the land and work the land, to federal subsidies is actually quite good. But access by farm workers' families, whether they're indigenous or not, to these subsidies is actually quite bad. So we suggest that they improve access by the farm workers to these subsidies. And finally, the third set, we are recommending a set of 3 sector-wide improvements in agricultural employment. Number one is what we call a level playing field. We believe that if you just focus export employers for inspection, then what you are doing is that we're actually favoring delinquent employers to actually sneak their product into export channels and therefore reap much higher profits. But actually what you're doing is you're favoring delinquent employers in the export market. So we believe that everyone should be subject to the same conditions for employment in the agricultural sector. Number two is that we have noticed, and we have actually learned very carefully and in detail about industry-led systems that are improving ethical labor management in Mexican farms. They have made very significant progress, and we expect that they will keep making that progress. And this is something that is important in view of the USMCA negotiations. They now cover a significant share of Mexican exports. And finally, labor democracy, which started as a reform in 2019, is quite welcome, and it should continue to expand. And we can contribute. We as a project, we as Hornamex, and we as a task force too. There are 3 ways in which we can collaborate. First, we can collaborate internally, so the members of the task force can agree to do one thing for another member of the task force. So, for example, we have labor unions, and they can collaborate with employers to do a number of things to improve workers' lot. Secondly, the task force can and will engage organizations in a broader environment, which is the community of learning, which is a number of associations that work to improve working conditions and living conditions in Mexico's agriculture. And finally, collaboration can improve with the Mexican government and across the Mexico-US border. Specifically, private-public collaboration, in my view, is something that can be very positive, because the Mexican government has recently announced a number of very positive initiatives for farm workers. What they're announcing includes education and childcare centers, housing for low-income workers, a comprehensive strategy for the protection of farm workers, and an alliance with industry ahead of USMCA negotiations. There is very significant alignment between what we are recommending and what the government is planning. So what we are suggesting is that we hold a very constructive public-private dialogue in the near future. And that's it. You can go to our webpage to look at what we are doing. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you both. All right. And so I've received one question from Professor Marley Weiss from the University of Maryland. And her question goes to the idea of reliance on private compliance mechanisms. She writes that these are not typically supported in most academic studies of such non-state enforcement mechanisms. So she notes that perhaps the only one that has a solid track record is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers Fair Food System, which is really a worker-driven enforcement model rather than an external, independent, often non-profit compliance machinery model. How do you, Augustine and Phil, respond to that problem? Because a lot of what we talk about is this public-private partnership and private compliance mechanisms. Do either of you have any input there?
Well, I'll start. Well, Augustine, I mean, she's really asking about fair trade programs. So the idea being that a private organization develops a protocol and then certifies suppliers as in compliance, and then that improves conditions over time. Okay, there's a big academic literature on this, and and the Walmart Foundation, which is supporting this Wilson Center project, does these things. But the basic idea is the private compliance systems are systems that help, but they're not the whole answer. And I think that that's going to be true of almost any kind of system, even a governmental system. If you think of the farm labor system as a super tanker, what you're trying to do is move it in the right direction. A union with a collective bargaining agreement could also move an industry in a more compliant labor direction. That's what union collective bargaining agreements do. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers, their Fair Food program in Florida, is one that bypasses the farmer and goes to the buyer and then develops a group buyer protocol that then growers who want to sell to those buyers wind up having to satisfy. And so therefore, I think we're not, our project is empirically based. We're asking what is actually happening in the farm labor market. I think the recommendations we come to are those that make things better for everyone involved, the workers involved, the employers, especially the compliant employers, the level playing field, and consumers, buyers, consumers who want to know what conditions are. So we haven't come up with any kind of magic formula which says if you're going to wind up, if you follow these recommendations, everything will be great. The way I see what we've done is we've moved that super tanker a little bit back toward a more compliant farm labor system that we can support, that we can say this is not one of the worst things in our society, but it is a labor market that offers good jobs for workers. That's what we're trying to do. I don't think there's any kind of compliance system out there that will take what has historically been a less than desirable labor market and transform it into something great. But what I think we can do, and what I hope we have done, is move it a little bit in the correct direction. I'll turn it to Augustine.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, well, I agree. please look carefully. We had 8 recommendations in all, and only one actually recognized the progress made by the private sector regarding this problem. But we are not recommending that the private sector engages alone in actually ensuring that this happens. We think there are new initiatives that have not been evaluated at the full sector-wide that they may be able to reach, and this is partly because they haven't reached their full potential. But if you look at food safety, which I mean Phil has often reminded us, that is a very successful model. Now that it's not a pure private thing. You need the government to come in and actually look at the produce and certify that it is free from pests or chemicals or whatever. So it's private public. And that has worked very, very successfully in my mind. Now, I should probably let you know that on January the 31st, the heads of the Mexican Social Security Institute, the Mexican Ministry of Labor, and the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture announced an alliance to ensure that they implement 100% compliance of labor regulations in Mexican farms. Now that's, as I say, something that we're in full alignment with. That is a government initiative, but we have been talking with the government for years now concerning something like this, which is what we call a level playing field. So I very much welcome that. And finally, there's a lot of inspections that are being developed in Mexico, not according to standard lines. So for example, there's a lot of electronic record matching to make sure that companies that export a lot actually provide the decent jobs that they're meant to provide. What we are saying is do the same with every other company in Mexico, not just with the exporters.
Thank you, Augustine and Fel. And so off of this, something that's always sort of in the background of these conversations, and I'm foreshadowing a bit to what we'll get into hopefully on the panel, but this question of scale. And so of all of these different regulations of H-2A visas in the United States, there is sort of a bureaucratic burden that is put on farmers in order to comply. And so I'm curious for both of you, if any of these recommendations put more of an onus on small farms and kind of accelerate consolidation of larger farms to get these certifications, for example, that Phil was outlining, and just how you see the small versus big farm sort of continuum there.
Well, we can get into this is sort of a bigger question than this project, but remember, almost every society started out having most of its people and most of its workers employed in agriculture. And a hallmark of economic development is fewer people employed in agriculture and fewer and larger farms. So that's a story in every society, whether it's the United States, Mexico. As the incomes go up, people move out of agriculture. Fewer and larger is the story of agriculture. There's a lot of small farms. The U.S. has almost 2 million farms. 100,000 of them account for 70% of farm output. I'm sure the system in Mexico is very similar. There's a lot of small subsistence farms and a relative handful of big farms that account for most of the output and most of the higher worker employment. There is no way, in my opinion, to design a system that's going to be easy for small farms to use and protective totally of farm worker rights. That doesn't mean there aren't small farms who treat their hired workers like family and treat them very well. But in general, most small farms are not terribly profitable. And as unions always say, it's hard to get blood from a stone. So it's really hard to get good wages and working conditions in farming systems where many farmers are struggling economically, because they're the ones who have the biggest incentive to cut costs. The example I usually use is the application of pesticides. Having done some work in agriculture, back in the 1970s, there were many small farmers who applied pesticides themselves. The regulations were much less strict. They didn't necessarily wear the appropriate safety clothes. They didn't necessarily, follow the protocols. The government made the application of pesticides and chemicals much more complex. An industry developed. And while it's true that some farmers still apply pesticides and chemicals themselves, increasingly that's an outsourced thing for small farmers. And that means that those outsourcers can provide the most modern and safe equipment. The workers are trained appropriately. And so it may not necessarily be a bad thing if complexity leads to outsourcing. And so in the case of labor, if you make it complex, why should a farmer who needs only 5 H2A workers learn those 22 attestations if there's an entity that, for a relatively small fee because of economies of scale, can provide those workers in a compliant way? So I don't necessarily, people often bring up this idea of, won't you put the small farmers out of business? Well, the answer is twofold. First, they're going out of business anyway. And secondly, do you really want to maintain people in business if the only way they can stay in business is with non-compliance with particular laws, whether it's chemicals or labor or anything else? So I don't have a good answer, but that's why economics are about trade-offs. If it's a trade-off between a bad and a good, pick the good. But if it's two goods, you want small farms and you want to have people there, then you need to think about which gets the higher priority. How do you incentivize things to get there?
Thank you, Phil. And thank you. As moderator, my role is to sort of be devil's advocate, or, present the common questions when none present themselves. Augustine, I'd like to ask you the same in terms of scalability and size of farms, but I think also what I think of when we talk about Mexico is informality as well, and labor informality, and how it's not a monolith across Mexico regionally. You have vast differences in the south versus the north. So how do you think about your recommendations in this very kind of uneven landscape as well?
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, I wanted to clarify that in Mexico we have a slightly different trend than what you see in the US. Although jobs in Mexican agriculture did fall from 1930 to about 1990, the year 2000, because of urbanization, industrialization, and the move to services. But actually, for the past 15 years, agricultural jobs have been growing, and agricultural waged jobs have been growing faster than any other jobs in agriculture. And for example, women have been moving from unpaid agricultural work to paid agricultural work, which, if provided with a decent job, actually means that their families will be much better off. So those are some of the trends that we are seeing in Mexico. And finally, another difference that I see is that small farms in Mexico, I don't really know if they're thriving or not, but they have been growing for the past 20 years. So we have more small Mexican export farms than we had 20 years ago, undoubtedly. And you also see a network of small service providers, many organic input providers, both for pests and for fertilizers, many advisors, many people working on leveling the soil, and etc. So there is a market of small firms in Mexico serving the agricultural export market, which is important. And there are a few large exporters who control maybe, I don't know, 30 or 40% of their product line. So for example, in some fruits, in some vegetables, etc. I could mention the names, but I've said I won't do it. And so a few concentrate, but often they are sourced from hundreds of small suppliers. And that's actually the challenge, actually making sure that you reach those smaller suppliers and that you're able to regulate them. And that's what a number of initiatives are taking place actually in this very task force by some members of our task force to make sure that we can enlarge coverage of the mechanisms through which we will be at least encouraging, maybe checking, maybe making sure that working conditions are decent.
Thank you, Augustine. And before we go to our quick 10-minute break, I did just want to posit a comment that was sent to us by a member of our task force, kind of speaking to this need for a multi-pronged approach, public, private, incorporating labor unions, etc. And so this is from Peter O'Driscoll, who is the executive director of the Equitable Food Initiative, which is responsible for the Ethical Charter Implementation Program, which is a private sector implementation mechanism. And so kind of answering this question from Professor Weiss from UND, Peter writes that the academic literature typically supports, as Professor Weiss noted, the academic literature typically supports only CIW Fair Food Program and established labor unions as the only legitimate forms of worker protection. That literature also acknowledges that such programs reach less than 1% of the US farm worker population. And so Peter asks, what does the questioner suggest will improve conditions for the other 99%, if not the voluntary programs, certifications, etc.? So just food for thought. Perhaps we'll have to broaden our task force and invite other folks to join to give our input and discuss this offline. But I'm going to let everyone have 8 minutes. We'll reconvene at 11:15 and bring on our 2 other experts, Darcy Vetter and Professor Laura Ann Minkoff-Stern. So we'll see you in 8 minutes.